Hi there, everybody. This is Kendall from Sager Family Farm. Thanks for joining me today. Today, I'm going to talk about honeybee health and Varroa mites, which are a little mite that bites bees and actually causes them to get sick. So I'm going to talk about what beekeepers can do to help honeybees with the Varroa mites and how we can see the Varroa mites. So I'm going to start, I'll explain a little bit more in just a minute, but first, just in case you're new here, I wanted to explain the format. So you guys can see and hear me, but I can't see or hear any of you, and no one else can see or hear you. So your mic and your camera will never be on during this session. If you have any questions for me, you can type them over here, and then I'll be able to read them. I usually get to the questions at the very end of the class, just because it's a little hard to talk and show you guys pictures and videos and all that cool stuff. So I will get to the questions at the end if you type them in there, so I'm not ignoring you on purpose. It's just a lot of things to do. And sometimes I'll have questions for you, and they'll pop up down here in the bottom, and I'll point them out when I have a question for you that you can answer. And when you ask me questions over here, only I can see them, so no one else can see what you're asking. So let's see. Well, with that, let's get started a little bit. So today I'm going to talk about honeybee health and Varroa mites. So I just want to say, like, who is this class for? Because I think this can be really helpful for a variety of reasons. So number one, if you're a beekeeper, if you have a honeybee hive in your yard, this is really important information for keeping your bees healthy, because Varroa mites are one of the top suspected causes for the reason that honeybees are dying. Number two, I think I've got some students watching, and they're doing a Save the Bees project. So if you're doing a Save the Bees project, this is pretty cool information, because actually a lot of beekeepers don't know all of this. As scientists, they're still learning about a lot of information about Varroa mites. So it's hard to keep on top of everything. So if you're doing a Save the Bees project, I'm going to actually show you some tools that you can make at home and share with beekeepers. Or you could even do an educational project with some of the information that I'm sharing right now. So if you're not doing either of those things and you're still watching me, the other cool stuff is I'm going to walk you through how I look for mites and the reason why I look for mites the way that I do. So this is going to be a way to approach things more scientifically. So if you like making experiments, if you like science, I'm going to walk you through some scientific thinking and some questions to ask yourself when you're designing an experiment, or if you're trying to measure some data, how to get the best data. So even if you don't have bees, this is still pretty cool, and you can apply it to some other scientific things. Let's see. So I see a few questions before we get started, and that's, when did I learn about Varroa mites? So I learned about Varroa mites, I think, before I even had honeybees. So I read a book about honeybees before I got started, which was about 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, I read a book, and it said there are these mites, and they live in the beehive. And I didn't know much about them. And from there, I started taking classes at my local bee club. So my bee club had some talks about Varroa mites. And then I live kind of near a university, UC Davis, and they have a lot of researchers that do some really cool research on Varroa mites. So I went out there to learn more. And you can also find lots of cool stuff online on YouTube. So I actually learn a lot about Varroa mites from a variety of sources, because things evolve. So the information I learned 10 years ago is no longer correct. So there's new information that shows different stuff about Varroa mites that we didn't know before. So I'm constantly trying to learn a little bit more about Varroa mites. So I'm going to try and share with you what we currently know about Varroa mites today. So first of all, let me show you what a Varroa mite is, since we're talking about these things. So here we see a little honeybee, and she has these kind of reddish brown insects on top of her. It almost kind of looks like a tick, maybe. And this is a Varroa mite. So I've got a big picture on the other side of the Varroa mite, and one is like kind of a little light pink one. That's actually the boy. So the girl Varroa mite is the big reddish brown one. The boy Varroa mite is the little pinkish one. And these are parasites, which means they live on the honeybee and they actually bite the honeybee and eat the fat bodies. So the fat that's inside of the bee. And that's how this Varroa mite lives. And biting the bee, it doesn't actually kill the bee when it bites it. So kind of like when a mosquito bites a human, it's not the mosquito doesn't kill the human from biting it, but mosquitoes can carry diseases, just like these Varroa mites can carry disease. And they can get the bees sick, just like mosquitoes could get us sick. So maybe not in the United States, but in other countries, people might get malaria or Zika. So these are diseases that mosquitoes can carry, and when the mosquitoes bite us, we can get sick from those diseases. So that's why the Varroa mite is so dangerous for the honeybee, is because it bites the honeybee and it transmits these viruses that can really get the bees sick, and it can even cause the entire beehive. There can be so much sickness that the entire beehive really just collapses and dies. So that's why it's so important to know how many Varroa mites are in your beehive and how to keep the levels down. So first, I'm going to show you guys a quick video to introduce the Varroa mite a little bit more, because it's a very nice video that I like to show. So let's take a look a little bit more about Varroa mites.
Since Varroa mites don't have any wings of their own, they slip into hives by hitching a ride on the backs of adult bees. And for the lucky mite, the trip includes an in-flight meal, as Varroa mites will begin feeding on honeybees' fat body tissue within a few minutes of clinging to bee. Once they've entered the hive, Varroa mites slip undetected into the vulnerable, uncapped brood cells. This is where the mites lay in wait until the bees cap the brood. Once a cell is capped, the mother mite, like a tiny spider, climbs atop the cocoon of the developing bee, tears open a hole, and begins to feed on its fat body tissue. Within 3 days, the mother mite lays her first egg, which always develops into a male. Then, she lays one female egg every 30 hours over the next week or so in her newly acquired home under the brood cap. And as each of these female mites mature, they mate with their brother. By the time the baby bee develops and leaves its infested cell, as many as 3 fertilized mites will emerge with it, and the cycle continues. Using this strategy, the Varroa mite population can grow as fast as the bee population it feeds on. But when summer ends and the bee population declines, the hive is left with a huge mite population, and that's dangerous. Too many mites in a hive will overwhelm and kill entire bee colonies. So what does that mean for everyone's favorite insect, the honeybee? Well, honeybee colonies with heavy mite infestations can't effectively pollinate or produce honey because they suffer from diseases and viruses transmitted by the mites. In fact, honeybees suffer from as many as 20 different mite-induced viruses, including the devastating Deformed wing virus, which prevents them from flying.
So that's a quick intro to how Varroa mites get into beehives so they can transfer from honeybee to honeybee, and where they live inside of the beehive and reproduce. So the first way we'll kind of examine, if we were going to go look for Varroa mites in our hive, why don't we just look for them? So we'll just kind of examine when we're opening the beehive. So where should we look in the beehive? So that is actually my very first question to you. So it just popped up down here is, where should we look for Varroa mites? Should we look for them on the foraging bees, so the bees that are flying around back and forth? Should we look for them on the honeybees that are in the beehive near the honey, so they're storing some of that nectar the foragers are bringing in? Or should we look for them near where the babies are in the beehive? So on the bees that are kind of taking care of the babies. So the little larvae and pupae, should we look around there? So where do you think we would find the most Varroa mites in this situation? So I'm going to show you guys some more videos of my beehives, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So let's see. First, let's take a look at one of my frames of honey. So this is a piece of my beehive, so it's a frame. So there's a bunch of frames inside my beehive, and there's some bees on top of it. So maybe there are some mites here, but in the video we just watched about Varroa mites, of where they like to reproduce, so where those mother mites are looking for, is actually closer to the babies. So the honey, even though there are bees here that I could check and see if there's any mites on them, it's maybe not the best place to look, because the mites are looking for where the baby bees are so that they can reproduce inside of the cocoons. So checking the foraging bees, that's really hard because they're all flying around. So it's really hard to check the foraging bees. Near the honey, there might not be as many, and so I might find the most near the baby bees. And it looks like a lot of you guys said, let's check near the babies. So some of you said, let's check the foraging bees. And there can be mites on foraging bees, because the mites might be transferring to another colony. So there might be mites there, but the most I think we're going to find near the babies. So let's take a look at where we can find the babies in the beehive. So here is a picture, or actually a video, of where I can find the babies. So here I'm kind of looking in the very middle of my beehive, because that's where the queen bee usually hangs out. And success here, this frame, it's got some honey in the corners, but in the middle it has these covered up holes, and those are baby bees in cocoons, so they're in the pupa phase. And if we zoom in a little closer, you might be able to see there's some white squishy things in some of the holes, and those are the larvae, and they're getting really big, so they're prepared to be covered by the other bees, and that is perfect for a mother Varroa mite, because she wants to sneak in just before the honeybees close the cocoon, so that she can then have her babies inside the cocoon with the little baby pupa that's growing. So this is where, kind of around the babies, is where I would kind of look. And let's take a look one more time around there to see if we can see any Varroa mites on these bees. So I know we're a little far away from the bees, and the Varroa mites are so tiny, so maybe smaller than a pinhead. So as we get closer to these bees, so as we zoom in and start looking near the larvae, these bees, I mean, I don't really see any Varroa mites. So I guess that's pretty good, right? Because we're not seeing any Varroa mites. But it's really hard. The bees are all moving. There's lots of different frames of bees in here. So it's pretty tricky to just look at the bees. And I'll show you guys a picture of why maybe this is not the best way to observe my mites and look for mites. So let's take a look at, this is the Varroa mite that we were looking for, these little red-brown insects on top of the bees. And more often, what we might see is the symptoms of the Varroa mite. So the symptoms, so these bees, all three types of these bees that I'm showing, are different bees with different viruses carried by the mite. So the bees that look really kind of shiny and greasy, they have chronic bee paralysis virus. So this is one of the viruses that when the mite bites the bee, then it injects it with this virus. So it causes the bees to look shiny and greasy. One of the worst ones that it said in the little intro video was the deformed wing virus. So you can see the bee in the middle has crinkled up wings, and she cannot fly. So this bee is probably going to be removed from the beehive. So she is so diseased that she can't even really fly or pollinate. And then the bee on the other side, her wings, it looks like they're split. So each bee has 4 wings. So there's 2 wings on each side. And in order to fly, the bees actually have special hooks in between the 2 wings. And they hook together in order to allow the bee to fly. So this split wing, so it's called K-wing because they kind of make her body look like a little K on each side. So her body is the up and down line, and then the wings form the K. So this virus is called K-wing, and it's another one that the mites can carry and transmit. And this bee, if she has K-wing on both sides, probably cannot fly. So, or she can kind of not fly very well. So she might just fall out of the hive and can't really get to any of the flowers. So these are viruses that the bees might carry. So let's take a look at our video again and see if we see any sick bees. Because maybe we would see some sick bees in here. So again, we'll wait to get like maybe a little bit closer because these bees all look pretty good to me, especially from here. So let's see if we see especially any deformed wing, any shiny looking bees. And I actually, on this frame, I'm looking extra good because I've looked at this a bunch of times, but I think all of these bees look pretty healthy to me. So maybe again, I have no Varroa mites. But on the downside, if I'm seeing symptoms of the mites and I'm seeing lots of bees that are sick and diseased, it might be too late to help my honeybees. So I want to find the mites earlier. So let's take a look again and see, where do the mites hang out on the bees? So on this picture, it actually shows where we're most likely to see the bees. And let me get my drawing tools out here so I can kind of draw. So here, this color here, this kind of like light purple color, it's showing up kind of over here on the top of the bee. And that's the part of the bee where I really see the most when I'm looking at the bees, when I'm holding a frame and looking at them. And it says less than 1% of the mites were found on the backs of the bees. So the mites want to be where the fat is on the bee. So they won't find that on the bee's back, on the thorax. They're actually more likely to be found on the bee's belly, so on her abdomen. So you can see this one right here. So this is where 60% of the mites were found on the bee. We're on the tummy right here where the most fat bodies were found. So that's where most of the bee's fat is. And so the mites were most often found on the belly. So if I'm using my eyes and just looking at a frame when I open my beehive, I'm not rolling each bee over to look at her belly. So I might get a chance at seeing less than 1% of the mites because I'm only looking at the bees' backs instead of looking at their bellies. So, and this is actually only research that came out in I think they started doing some preliminary stuff in 2018, but this paper was published in 2019. So this is actually pretty brand new information. And I learned about this from a talk at a local bee club from Samuel Ramsay. So I learned about this by listening to experts in this field who are studying Varroa mites. So, and I'm constantly learning new things. So this is brand new information that came out, is most mites are found on the bellies of bees. So if we're just relying on our eyes, it doesn't seem like this is a great way to look for mites in my beehive. So let's see what our other options are. And actually, before I move on, let me show you this picture of the bee's abdomen and the Varroa mite. And this is why the Varroa mite is so sneaky, because you might be thinking, why don't these bees just clean off all of the mites? And if we look at this picture of the mite has all of these little hairs on it, and they're all going in one direction. Same thing with the honeybee's abdomen. So the mite has actually evolved so that its skin, so its outer skin and its hairs, feel exactly like a honeybee abdomen. So when that mite sneaks onto the belly of the bee and the bee starts to groom herself, it feels just like her tummy. So that way the mite is camouflaged onto the bee so that it can sneakily hang out and bite the bee without the bee noticing. So that's why these mites are so tricky. So let me show you another way that we can look for mites. So another way that I might look for mites is that some of the mites die inside of the beehive. So some of them die inside the cocoons. And so the mother mite, she passes away and her children emerge out. But the bees will clean out those cells and then they'll fall to the bottom of the beehive. So another way maybe I could look for mites is to look for the dead mites that are coming out of the cells. So one way that I do that, so I have actually a piece of a beehive here. So this is the bottom part of a beehive. Oh, it has lots of beehive stuff in it. I'm gonna have to vacuum after this. So this is a bottom board for a beehive. So I would stack the boxes of the beehive on top of this. The bees would come in right here at the bottom, and then they'd go up into the beehive. This bottom board is kind of special though, because it has a screen. So right here, there's a screen that the mites can fall through. And then I have this board that goes underneath, and it's a white board, and I can see red mites on top of it pretty easily. So let me show you guys what it looks like if I was going to use one of these to check for my mites. So let's look at a video that I took yesterday looking at one of these boards. So here you can see there's the back of that board. So I'm at the back of the beehive right now, and I cleaned off this board and I left it there for 24 hours. And let's kind of zoom in. So there's a little bit of dust, but then right there, that's a mite. So now we're getting more successful. Now I'm actually seeing some mites. Oh, there's another mite. And then you can see some of the other things that look like dust. That's not really a mite. But then I went through and counted how many mites did I see on this bottom board. So it looks like I found 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I saw 5 mites on this bottom board. So what does that mean? Is that a good number? Is that a bad number? What do I do with this information? So let's take a look at maybe what we think could be going on inside of the beehive based on what I'm seeing underneath the beehive. So for my 3 beehives that I have out back, I have a yellow beehive, and that's the one we checked. We have an orange beehive, and I have a pink beehive. So if I see 5 mites on the bottom, then maybe I think there's kind of a few mites spread out inside of the beehive. So maybe there's a kind of a low number of mites inside of that beehive. But I don't really know what's happening inside the beehive just based on the bottom. Because if I went to my orange hive and I saw a bunch, I saw maybe like 10 mites on my bottom board, does that mean there's double the number of mites in my orange hive? Or does it mean that my orange hive, the bees in that hive, maybe there's special kinds of bees that are better at cleaning mites off of themselves, and so there's more mites on the bottom? So what does it really mean that I see lots of mites on the bottom board? And same thing over here is maybe in the pink hive, I only see 3 mites on the bottom board, but maybe these bees are pretty bad at cleaning up their house, and there's lots of mites inside of their hive. So it's hard to say exactly what's going on inside of the beehive, but usually the numbers are pretty close, like my yellow hive, if I'm measuring accurately. Unfortunately, there's another problem with monitoring this way. So let's take a look at this example. So what if all my beehives are different sizes? So the yellow hive is kind of medium. It's got 2 boxes, and I see 5 mites on that. And the orange hive is very small, and I see 5 mites on that board. And the pink hive is big, and I see 5 mites on that board. So in this situation, now I'm going to ask you guys another multiple choice question over here in the bottom is, which of these hives has the worst mite infestation? So the worst infestation would be the most mites per bee. So which hive has the most mites per bee in this hive? Usually in my beehive, so I keep bees in kind of a medium-sized box. So that's what it's called in beekeeping. There's a larger box called a deep and a smaller box called a shallow. All of my boxes are medium, which means there are approximately 10,000 bees in each box. So my yellow hive has about 20,000 bees in it. The orange hive has about 10,000 bees in it, and the pink hive probably has about 30,000 bees in it. So the pink hive has the most bees. The orange hive has the least bees. So it looks like We're all weighing in, and a lot of people are saying the orange hive. That's a very good guess. So let's talk about which of these hives has the most mites per bee. So all of these hives have the same number of mites in them, but since the pink hive has the most bees and it has the same number of mites as the other one, that means it has the lowest infestation level. So this one is the healthiest in terms of not having many Varroa mites per bee. The yellow hive has a middle amount of bees, so it's got 20,000 bees, and it still has the same amount of mites as the other two hives, the smaller hive and the larger hive. So the hive out of these group that is doing the second best is the yellow hive. And then the hive that's doing the worst out of these ones is the orange hive, because it only has 10,000 bees, but it has the same number of mites as the pink hive next to it that has 30,000 bees. So that means there's a lot more mites per bee in the orange hive. And you can kind of see that with how the mites are distributed inside of the beehive. You can see that, let me draw a little bit here. In the orange hive, there's 5 mites jammed in this box right here. Whereas in the yellow hive, there's kind of like 2 mites over here and 3 mites over here. So there's fewer mites in each box. So even though in this example, I see 5 mites on each board, the pink hive is doing pretty well, and the orange hive is not doing very well. So it's hard to make a formula. I would have to change my formula of, are my bees doing well or are they not doing well, depending on how big my beehive is. So this is considered a way to measure mites, but not really the most accurate if you're trying to do something scientific. So it can give you an idea of what's happening in your beehive, but it's not very specific. So let's take a look. Let's see. I'm going to see. Let's take a look at another way to measure for mites. And I have a video for this one, and that is right here. So this is going to be a sugar roll test. So this is the most accurate way that is easy to do at home. So I use this little jar. It's a peanut butter jar with a screen on the top. And then the other tools that I use for this is I have a 1/2 cup measuring cup, and I'm going to use that to actually measure bees. And then I have powdered sugar. It has to be powdered sugar and not granulated sugar. And then I have a spray bottle with just water in it and a white bucket. So I'm going to actually try to get mites off of the bees using these tools. So again, I'm going to go into my beehive and I'm going to look for where I think the mites are going to be. So I'm going to look at that frame that this is the same frame we were looking at before. So it looks like all the bees are pretty healthy. I didn't see any mites on this frame, but the babies are definitely here. So there's the cocoons, there's the larvae. So if I were a mite, this would probably be where I was hanging out in the hive. And I might be on those nurse bees, so those worker bees that are taking care of them. So then I actually shake that into the bucket. And you can see a lot of the bees are flying away. Those are the older bees that might be foragers. The young bees, bees that are less than 3 weeks old, they don't like to fly around. They're the ones doing all the inside chores and taking care of the babies. So they actually stay in the bucket because they don't know where their house is. So I try to find a few frames that have babies on them and I shake them off. So even though I am shaking pretty strongly, it doesn't hurt the bees. The larvae are usually pretty okay. So all of these end up developing into adult bees and they're just fine. So even though it looks kind of crazy, this is not really hurting the bees. It's just kind of startling them off the frame and then they fall off into my bucket. So now, and I was also quickly looking at each frame, making sure my queen wasn't there because I don't want to measure my queen because we're going to put these guys in my little peanut butter jar. So I give the bucket a shake so that all the bees fall down. And then I put a 1/2 cup of bees into my jar and I pretty quickly try to put the lid on so that the bees don't fly away. And then I can dump all the rest of these bees back into the beehive. And I actually took a little pause in between the next video clip, and I helped kind of scoop the bees off of the ground and put them back in so that I wouldn't step on them. So that's why the ground is pretty clear right now. But then I take a tablespoon, so kind of like a heaping pile of powdered sugar, and I put it into the cup. And then I'm going to swirl it around for about 30 seconds. The reason why I do this is because the powdered sugar is very fine and dusty, and it actually causes the mites that are hanging onto the bees to fall off. So they lose their grip on the bees and they fall off. So this fine powdered sugar causes the little mites to fall off. Now that I've shook them for about 30 seconds, I can shake the top. So these bees that are inside the jar are probably not very happy, but it's a small number of bees in the hive, and it's helping me do a health assessment. So just like if I was to go to the doctor and they take a bit of my blood to test to see if I'm healthy, it's a small part of me and it hurts for a bit, but I'm okay. Same thing with the bees, is this is a small portion of the bees in the hive, and it's better to find out if the bees are healthy. And then I'm actually spraying this down with water. That causes the sugar to melt, and then I can look for the bright red Varroa mites. So they look like little specks because we're a little further away, but if you look really closely, you can count the Varroa mites. And this is one of the most accurate ways to check for mites in the beehive. So let's take a look at, I can actually use some formulas to take a look at what's in the beehive, because I used a half cup of bees. So that is actually a pretty standard level of bees. So, and I'm checking the number of mites on that exact number of bees. So no matter how big my beehive is, I'm always checking the same number of bees. And so I can kind of multiply that out to the size of my hive. So the formula we use during this is we take the number of mites that we counted in the bucket, and then we divide that by the number of bees that we measured. And when we multiply by 100, that gives us how infested this beehive is, like a % of infestation. So I know that a half cup of bees actually contains about 300 bees. What's important is that I always measure the same way. So I kind of take a scoop and then I'll dump it in when the half cup is pretty level. So I always measure the same way. So I might have a few more bees or a few less bees in my measurement, but as long as I'm always measuring the exact same way, that is what's most important for a scientific experiment, is always doing it the exact same way. So I always shake the jar the same way, and I always shake it for the same amount of time, and I always try to take the same scoop of powdered sugar and the same scoop of bees. So a half cup of bees has about 300 bees in it. And then, so I actually kind of simplified this equation. So if I'm always dividing by 300 and then multiplying by 100, that's the same as just dividing by 3. So I take my number of mites and divide by 3. So the number of mites that I counted in my bucket was 5. So which is actually the same as what I saw on my board, but it could have been different. So this is a very accurate way to say that. And so I have 5 mites divided by 3 bees. And so I have about a 1.66% infestation rate. So what does that number mean? So that is actually, it's a pretty small number. And here is what I use to figure out what to do with my bees. So my bees are pretty healthy at 1.66%. At 3%, that's when I start to think about, maybe I should try to knock down the level of mites. Maybe I should start trying to do something. At 6%, that is actually getting to be a pretty high number. And that is, the bees are starting to get into trouble. So I definitely want to do something about it by then. And when I get above 10% for that number, that is getting dangerously high. And I would actually expect that if I saw a number like that in the fall, so September, October, I would actually expect that beehive to die. that year. So that's why I'm trying to address this earlier in the problem so that it doesn't get to be a really bad problem with my bees. So let's take a look. Whoops. So the other thing with this that I'm taking a look at, this is actually kind of interesting because it's kind of what humans are doing now. So if we take a look at where we are on this timeline, so down at the bottom, we're kind of in this May, June range. So if we're looking at the mite population, which is this red line, we're pretty low right here. So if we try to fix things right here, when the mite population is low, that's going to cause this curve to maybe be a little lower, like this. So when the population, if I didn't do anything, the population of the bees, the yellow line, so right here, it kind of peaks in June and July. And then when there starts to not be as many flowers, the bee population starts to decline. But the mite population is still rising. So this is where we get into a really bad situation where there are a lot of mites and not as many bees. So those bees are in trouble. And why this is kind of interesting is it's because it's what humans are trying to do right now with coronavirus. So anyone who's watching me here in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, we have been sheltering in place for a pretty long time. I feel like it's been 2-3 months. We've been hanging out at home. I'm not allowed to go to school. I can't hang out with my friends. I can't go to a playground and play on a play structure. So we're staying home. And that's because there's a disease that's affecting humans that we want to stop the spread of it. So we're down here as humans, and we're trying to make this curve really small. Because as humans, if we hit this area, that would be the area where there's not enough doctors and not enough medicine to help save us. So that's why we're down here and we have to shelter in place. And even though it's, oh, we don't like doing this, it's better for us. So it's helping save us. So same thing with the bees is if we address this, when it's a smaller number, we can keep the overall mite population low and the bees healthier. Whereas if we let it get all the way up here, there's not enough bees available. And I don't have, if I put in stronger medicine, I might end up hurting my bees. So there's really not a lot I can do if I just let it run wild like that. So it's kind of the same situation that we're all in right now. So I'm going to very quickly say some ways that beekeepers can treat the mites. Just because it gets a little complicated, this could be a whole day lecture in and of itself, but I'm just going to quickly touch on it for just a minute, and then I'll take questions. So up at the top, I think the part where I'm covering up is the physical and mechanical and cultural ways of controlling the mites. So since the mites breed with baby bees, I can try to stop there being baby bees. So I can actually cage the queen. So I can put a little mesh over top of her on a frame so she can only walk around in one spot. And I can cage her there for about a month. So then there start to be no babies in the hive. And then I can release her and then she can go start to have baby bees. So even though this kind of like levels out where the bee population is, it really has a big effect on the mite population. So we can stop the queen from having babies by controlling where she can have babies. I can divide my beehive, which means I take my queen bee and move her. This is kind of like a swarm, and that's how bees procreate. So I can move the queen and some bees to a new hive, and then she starts having babies there where there were no babies. So that helps lower the mite population there. In the original hive, now there's no queen to lay eggs. So they have to raise a new queen bee. And so that time takes about a month. So now there's no babies in that hive for about a month. So no babies, lower mite level. The other way is to remove the boy cocoons from the hive, which are the drones. Because mites actually prefer drone cocoons because drones take a few more days in their cocoon to hatch, which means the mother mite can have an extra baby in that time. So the more boys there are, the more mites there can be. So in a sense, mites prefer the boys. If you remove the boy brood, you can actually decrease the number of mites. So I put this in a green category because it's really safe. The other ways for beekeepers to control the mites are biopesticides. So it's a pesticide designed to kill bugs. So it's really important to follow the directions exactly so that you don't kill the bees and you don't hurt yourself. So I actually use this first one, Formic Acid, which is a natural acid. Oops, can't draw a circle anymore. Boop. So right here, Formic Acid. So that one, it's a naturally occurring acid in honey, and it doesn't build up in the beehive. So after this dissipates, it's totally gone. So this is organic, really safe in terms of having it in the beehive. It is dangerous in terms of applying it because it's an acid. So I have to wear gloves and I have to wear a respirator, which is a special mask that allows me not to breathe the vapors from this. So when I'm applying it, I have to wear special equipment. But it's totally safe to be around the honey, and I can eat the honey afterwards, and none of this stuff sticks around. So that's why this is a biopesticide, is it degrades really nicely. There's others. So the ones with the stars are ones that are safe to use around honey. Thymol and oxalic acid, not safe when there's honey around. So it can actually get into the honey and stick around. So you cannot put this on when there's honey on the beehive, which in California is really challenging because we almost always have honey. Then if we go to conventional pesticides, there are these ones here. I don't usually use these ones because there's a lot of danger for mites actually becoming resistant to it. So these ones have been around a lot longer, and if you don't use them the right way, so if I use too little of it, so it's not enough to kill the mites can actually get used to it, and then it stops killing the mites, and then this medicine is no longer useful. So the way that we usually apply all of this medicine, you're like, how do you give medicine to a bee? Is most of these come in like a little patty. So this little white patty, that's formic acid, and you can put it on, actually see all of these little specks on top of it are actually dead mites on the patty. Other ones are strips that you hang down, and then even some of them are a liquid that you can kind of squirt into the hive, and the bees will kind of lick up off of themselves. So you squirt it in between all of the frames. So that's how you give bees medicine. So let's see, I think that is pretty much my presentation on honeybee health and Varroa mites. And let me go back to full screen and see if you guys have any questions. So let me go back. So one of them is like, wow, how do you know all this stuff? Because it's so cool. So a lot of people ask me if I went to school to study insects, and I did not. I went to school to study computers. And I just really, really, really like learning. So I try to learn in a variety of ways. So like I mentioned in the beginning, is I'm always looking for information. And there are people who are going to school studying bees and even these Varroa mites specifically. So I mentioned a guy named Samuel Ramsay. He just graduated from University of Maryland with his doctorate. So he's been in school for a long time, and he put out a lot of that research that I was citing just now. So I saw him talk at an event here in the Bay Area, and that's how I learned all of this stuff. So I basically went to a special class to learn more about the Varroa mites. But there's lots of information on YouTube that you can read in magazines. So you could read, there's Bee Culture magazine. So there's a lot of different magazines that actually have articles about like, hey, what do we know about Varroa mites? So that's why actually, so 10 years ago, we thought the Varroa mites drank blood. So they drink the blood of the bee. But only in the last few years have we figured out they actually eat fat. So that actually had a huge impact on the scientific community because the medicines that we were trying to give to bees, we put it into their blood because we thought, oh, well, the mites eat the blood. And then if they bite the bee and drink the blood, we can kill the mites. But the mites weren't eating blood. They were eating fat the whole time. So we were trying to kill the mite in a spot where the mite didn't even eat that food. So now that we figured that out, we can create new medicines. So new medicines are actually currently being developed. So that's how I kind of learned all of this stuff. Let's see. And someone's asking me, do I treat throughout the year or only towards the end of the summer? So I actually only treat when I need to treat. So I use that mathematical formula, and when it hits 3% or more, then I treat. So it doesn't matter the time of year. I just look at my bees throughout the year. So I usually start monitoring in June. So in June, I start looking at my bees and looking at mite numbers. The reason why I start in June is because I actually do a treatment in the spring. So I actually divide every single one of my beehives. So I split them. So that's actually my first treatment of the year, is a split. So I'm dividing my beehive, creating a condition where there's no babies. And that's my first treatment. And then I start monitoring the bees at June to see how effective that was. So some of my beehives are looking great. Some of them are in the 3% plus zone already, and I'm going to treat them now. Some bees take a little longer, so it might be July, August, September by the time they hit that 3% mark. And then I have to treat them a little bit later. So I don't actually use like always treat in October, always treat in June. I actually always monitor my beehives for mites and only treat them when they need to be treated. And that I think is a really important thing to do, because if I'm treating when they don't need to be treated, I'm really like kind of unnecessarily medicating my bees. And I certainly don't want to take medicine if I don't have to take medicine. So I don't want to put the bees through this stress, because like I said, I wear a special mask so I don't breathe this stuff. The bees don't really like this stuff. So that's why I don't put the medicine in unless I have to. Let's see. Does it help if bees have more food in the summer? Would planting more bee attracting flowers help? Yes, actually. So nutrition has a big impact on the bee's immune system. So the more food and the more nutritious food that's available for the bees, the better health that they're going to be in. Kind of the same for us. If I wasn't very well nourished, if I had just had one type of food to eat and I ate that for about a month, and then maybe there were some people who were sick around me and they're coughing a little bit, I might be more susceptible to that disease because I'm not very healthy to begin with. But if my immune system is really strong, if I'm really healthy, I have a better shot at fighting off those diseases. So same thing for the bees. We find that more like the well-nourished bees are better at fighting off disease. So the varieties of plants that you have, if you have a big variety of plants, that's really helpful for the bees. And even if you can only plant a few, odds are your neighbors probably have some plants. So anything you can do is really helpful for those bees. So good nutrition does help the bees. Because actually one of the other kind of scary parts about the Varroa mite is the fat inside of the honeybee actually has a lot to do with its immune system. So this mite is actually eating the immune system of the bee while injecting it with viruses. So that's why this mite is so dangerous. Let me scroll back through. Let's see. I saw a question of how do I get rid of Varroa mites, and I think I answered that at the end of those various treatments. So those treatments that you can put in, the pesticides and things like that, it's a low enough level of pesticides that it doesn't really hurt the bees, but it's a high enough level of pesticide that it kills the mites. It might not kill all of them, but it kills a lot of them. And that is actually another good use for a screened bottom board. So before I put in a treatment, if I want to measure how effective it is, I go and I clean my bottom board so that I can see everything really well. And then I put Vaseline on it so any little mites that drop down can't crawl away if they're still alive. Then I'll put this in the bottom of my hive, and then I put on my treatment. And when my treatment is done, so usually 24 hours later, I pull out that board and I see how many mites there are. So I should see a big number of mites if my treatment is working. So a really good way to measure this would be the day before I decide to treat, I can put this tray in, see how many mites drop down. Maybe it's only 5, like I saw before. And then I'm going to clean off my board. I'm going to put the tray back in, and then I'm going to apply my treatment and come back the next day and then pull it out. If I see 5 again, that means my treatment wasn't really any better than what the bees were doing. If I see 25 mites, I know this treatment is killing mites. So there's a lot more mites on the ground than are on the bees at this point. So that's how we treat them, and that's how I measure how effective the treatment is. Let's see. What do Varroa mites do for the world that is good? That's a good question. I am hard pressed to answer that one. I don't know that they do anything good. So let's see. I'd say Varroa mites, they are a parasite. And I'd say they're a very dangerous parasite because if I were a good parasite, so if I was living off of a host organism, so a Varroa mite and a honeybee. So a good parasite would eat from the honeybee, so bite it and eat it and not kill it. Because if I kill my host, then what am I going to eat? So a good parasite might keep its host alive so it continues to have a food source. But these Varroa mites are particularly dangerous because they are killing the bees. And then they'll hop on the bees that go to other hives and spread this particularly destructive type of mite. So I don't really know what good they do. I don't think they're very good. I think they're pretty sad because they are hurting our bees. So let's see if there's any more. It looks like I've gotten to all of the questions so far. If you think of more questions, feel free to send me a message, an email, ask your parents to contact me if you're a student that's watching. The other way, if you as a student and you don't have bees and you want to help, so some ways to help would be planting for bees, so trying to keep them nice and healthy to begin with. You could take some of this information, kind of put it in a poster and share it with local beekeepers, or that bucket that I was using, and I had all of those little tools. One tool that's actually pretty easy to make is that little sugar shaker that I was using. That can be an old peanut butter jar, and you just take the label off, and then probably with a parent's help, you can actually cut out the top and put in a screen. So the screen has to be small enough that a bee can't fit through, but big enough that a mite can fit through. So it's 1/4-inch openings. So you can actually make those tools for beekeepers to encourage them to check their mite levels. So if you're a student trying to help out with this situation, those are some ways without having a specific, like a beehive, that you can encourage beekeepers to be monitoring for this really big problem. Because right now, scientists are really zeroing in on the Varroa mite and thinking that it is the #1 cause of why bees are dying right now. So thank you guys so much. It looks like I got all of your questions. And I hope you tune in next week. Next week, we're going to do an update on our caterpillars. And I still have to think of what we're going to do next Thursday. I've had some requests for some sheep lessons. So let me see if I can get that together. If I can't, I will definitely do a sheep lesson in 2 weeks instead of next week. So bye. See you next time.